Merry Christmas, Life Group leaders. I hope that you're having a blessed holiday season. This time of year can be very busy or it could be very lonely. And so I want to encourage you to reach out to every person in your life group sometime this month. Just check in with them, see how they're doing, and remind them that even if they're not home on Sundays, they can still worship with us at our Christmas Eve service at 5 o'clock on Christmas Eve. I will trust that you will word that invitation more elegantly than I just did. So, Life Group leaders, I appreciate you. Today, as we go over our lesson overview, I just want to quickly cover what we didn't cover last week because we're jumping a long time in the narrative from where we were a couple of weeks ago to where we are today. So last week we skipped Numbers chapter 14, and since leaving Mount Sinai, the Israelites traveled a few months toward the land of Canaan, and there they arrived at the southern border of the Promised Land, and they set up camp there. 1 through 3 of chapter 13 indicate that God commands Moses to send out 12 representatives of each tribe of Israel to explore the land before all of Israel makes its way into the land. But if you read the recap of the story in Deuteronomy chapter 1, it says that the people themselves requested the exploratory party be sent out. So it seems that God really just gave them what they wanted rather than initiating the exploration party. And so the very fact that they didn't trust God enough to enter the land sight unseen is a testament to their potential lack of faith that they demonstrate in this lesson that we skipped over. All these explorers go out and they have very colorful names. Really the only two that you need to remember are Caleb and Joshua because their roles become critical as the story unfolds. And so Moses gives the explorers very careful instructions. They are to travel deep into the land and collect information about what's the agricultural conditions like, what are the strength of the people who live there, and how are their cities fortified. And they were also supposed to bring back some fruit from the land. And so as we see, that's exactly what they did. They journeyed for about 40 days, and they probably covered 350, 400, 450 miles, somewhere in there. And the explorers return and give their report. And they describe the land as very rich and plentiful, but they also report that the people are large and powerful and well defended. And Caleb, hearing all of this negativity from the other explorers, steps in and he says that we can go and take the land regardless of the strength of the people who live there because God is on our side. Victory is a given. I mean, if God is for us, who can be against us? And the other explorers reject this idea and claim that the Canaanites are too strong for Israel and that they will be devoured. Then they basically incite a rebellion with the other Israelites by saying, we seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes and we look the same to them. So at the end of the chapter, the Israelites are at a critical juncture where they listen to the negative reports of the 10 explorers, or they trust that God will drive out the Canaanites, what Joshua and Caleb were saying. And that question was answered in chapter 14. There's an outright rebellion of the people against God and his appointed leaders, Moses and Aaron. And once again, they are regretting that God ever brought them out of Egypt, and they are convinced that they will be killed and murdered by the Canaanites. And so they elect not to enter the promised land. And then God becomes angry because they've rejected what he's called them to do. And as a rejection of God's guidance, God gives them what they want, that they will not enter the promised land. The entire generation, with the exception of Moses, Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua, will die in the wilderness, wandering for 40 years until every single one of their generation is dead, and only their children will inherit the promised land. It's the very people who had seen firsthand the marvelous and miraculous demonstration of God's omnipotence against one of the most powerful nations of the ancient world now long to return to a world of slavery rather than believe a word of blessing. The sinful human tendency, even among Christians, is to lapse back into the addictive ways of sin and despair after having seen the outward demonstration of God's working on their behalf. That is on full display in this passage. And you would think after that story that the God's people would take God's leadership seriously, that we didn't follow him and now every one of us is going to die. But in the next few chapters, we can see that the people rebel again against Moses and Aaron, and they were like, we're going to go back to Egypt, and, who are you to lead us? And God deals with this rebellion of his anointed leaders with severity. The incident, we call it the rebellion of Korah, because Korah was one of the principal leaders of the rebellion. And basically, anybody who was in Korah's camp was swallowed up in an earthquake. God dealt very swiftly with their rebellion. And so that brings us really to our passage today. There's some traveling stories in there, but we start Numbers 20. Our passage today is 1 through 13. If you just pick this up from the beginning, the narrative essentially skips 37 years of wandering in the wilderness to bring us to this point where they're just getting ready to prepare to enter the promised land. So in verse 1, that we learn that the Israelites have returned to Kadesh, the region south of the promised land, where the older generation made their refusal to enter. And the author notes that Miriam, the older sister of Moses and Aaron, dies after they arrive here. And Miriam's death is notable because she is not only the most important woman in Israel at the time, but she symbolizes the older generation that was dying off before the younger generation could possess the land of Canaan. In verses 2 through 5, the younger generation repeats the rebellious pattern that their parents had done many times in this book. They complain that Moses and Aaron have brought them out of Egypt to die. There's no food and there's no water. And so God instructs Moses to take the staff of Aaron out of the tabernacle, assemble the leadership of Israel, and speak to a particular rock. Out of the rock, water will flow so the people of Israel and their livestock will be able to drink. So the people are complaining to God, and God's providing for their needs. Meribah is the name of the place where this incident takes place. It's a Hebrew name. It means fighting or contention. And that's what they called the water that came out of the rock, and it's what they named the place where the story happened. And the thing is, the people had already named a place Meribah, or fighting, in Exodus 17. And so the naming of this place probably brought into their mind that story. So here's what happened. Moses grabs his staff, he gathers the assembly leadership of Israel in front of the rock, and then he disobeys God's command. Instead of speaking to the rock so that God could cause water to flow out of it, Moses loses his temper with these people, which honestly, how is he not lost his temper yet? I mean, all of the things that they've done. He reprimands the assembly. He starts yelling at them, and then he strikes the rock twice with his staff. And because of Moses and Aaron's actions at the rock, God condemns both of them to not enter the promised land as well. That they, just like the rest of the older generation, they will die before entering the promised land. And so only Joshua and Caleb would now see the land of Canaan. Moses did just what God told him to do, but then he added a couple of flourishes of his own. The first is he rebuked the people, and you can see this. He says, "Listen, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And then he struck the rock twice with his staff, and the water did pour out. But the Lord was extremely displeased with Moses and Aaron, and God's punishment was harsh. You do not trust me to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites. Therefore, you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. Moses and Aaron, like all of the people who rebelled against God's plan, will not be permitted to enter the promised land. Now, there are scholarly arguments about the exact action that Moses was punished for, and you can, if you study this in any commentaries, you can read a lot of these discussions, but really the question they're getting at is, why did God punish Moses and Aaron for what happened at the rock? Moses and Aaron had been frustrating with God's people before. This is the big deal in this story over any of those. What's different this time? Here's the big difference. This time, Moses' frustration was on display not only in front of God, but it was in display on all of the people in front of him. He didn't just call the people rebels. He took the Lord's instruction and he used them as a means to justify his own self-interest and his own feelings. And the Lord said that Moses and Aaron would be the agents for the delivery of the water from the rock, but then his own self-centered attitude erupted as Moses tried to usurp God's own glory and his own authority, because he said this, and this is, I really think this is where he screwed up his attitude. He said, "Shall we bring forth this rock for you water?" And that attitude really shows that he's equating himself with God, that like me and God are together, and God's like, no, 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 because that presumption would not only have implications on Moses, but it also teaches the people that Moses kept the full power of God from being evident to all of the people, and thus he robbed God of glory and the fear and the reverence that would be due to him. Moses' leadership failed in this crucial moment when he stopped trusting God and he started acting on his own impulses. But now let's talk about them hitting that rock. So when they did that, what a lot of people think is that not only did Moses and Aaron disrespect God and disobey God in front of all of Israel, but they tried to claim that it was through their striking of the rock that the water would flow. In other words, they did the sort of ritualistic things that a pagan magician would do, performing an incantation, rather than acting as a spoken representative to the one true God. And so God himself tells Moses and Aaron that why they're being punished in verse 12. He said, "Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land that I give them." Now, some people think this is overly harsh on Aaron because Moses was the one doing all the talking and Moses was the one doing hitting on the rock. But Aaron was guilty as well because he did not prevent Moses from sinning. Evidently, he could have done this and God would have refrained from punishing him, but he did not. And so in some ways, this is kind of like the silence of Adam in Genesis 3, where everybody's like, well, Eve ate the fruit and she did this or whatever, but we know from that passage that Adam is standing right there with Eve the entire time. It does not say a word. And so when you look at what Aaron did and what Moses did, both men inappropriately took God's place as the center of attention and failed to do what was right. They didn't trust God, they lacked faith, and so they were punished in the same way that the unbelieving generation was punished. They would not get to enter the promised land. But in spite of Moses' disobedience, God still provided for his people by giving them water. That was their need in the first place. God blesses people even through his disobedient servants. Nevertheless, this in no way justifies a light view of sin, because Moses experienced severe discipline for his unfaithfulness to God. I think from our lesson today, it's pretty clear that grace is never permission for complacency or presumption. By our carelessness and our sinful neglect, we can sin away forever some of the privileges of our calling. Now, we're not going to lose our salvation itself, but our opportunities for service, for leadership, the possibility of being useful to the kingdom, and our contribution to the ongoing purposes of God can be closed forever by our own rebellion against him. And if Moses can fall away, in Numbers we read that Moses was an incredible leader. If Moses could fall in this way, then definitely so I can, and so you can as well. And by God's grace, even failures as great as the ones of Moses are not the end. Because we can look at one man's moral failure with the knowledge that it could have been us. Maybe it is us. But even so, moral failures do not separate us from the ultimate fulfillment of God's purposes. We will be redeemed. Moses didn't enter the promised land. He was cost that, but yet the New Testament declares him faithful in all of God's house. And the New Testament reminds us of the confidence that in all of God's house, every single person in God's house has the fulfillment of our redemption in Christ. And I think that's really the crux of the lesson today, that there are consequences that will close doors of potential in our lives, but nothing, Paul writes in Romans 8, nothing can separate us from Christ's redeeming work and his love for us. So as always, I have questions for you guys, maybe to ask your class at given points in time to help illustrate some of the principles of the lesson, maybe help them understand what it is that God's trying to communicate to them through the lesson. And sometimes it's just to help build that sense of community in your life group, that we help people have a place where they can share life's burdens with one another and experience the abundant life that we have in Christ. And so it's belong, it's believe, it's become. And so our belong questions this week, really I just had one, and it's thinking about a time when there was a rule, whether it was in your home growing up or at school, that you wished you didn't have to obey. Like, what was that one rule that you were like, man, I wish there was not this rule in my life? The believe question is, what were the Israelites upset about at the beginning of the passage? How did the people of Israel recall their time in Egypt? What does it tell us about their hearts in this moment? And how can we remember God's goodness when life doesn't seem so good? And then finally, our become question. What is your response when life doesn't seem fair? How should our faith in Christ change our perspective on unfair situations or circumstances? That's all I've got for this week. And so I'm praying for you as you prepare during this holiday season, that you would just see that one central truth that your class needs to focus in on, that the Spirit would make that abundantly clear for you as you prepare. And please just let me know if you need anything. I really appreciate you. Love you. Let me know if there's anything I can do for you. Godspeed.